a normalization deal would be an achievement. Certainly in Saudi Arabia, dealing with the Wahhabi factions inside that country, and the long simmering fears of an Iranian nuclear capability. And in Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu certainly has made peace without the settling the Palestinian question, something that he's showing the world is achievable.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has hailed recent so-called normalisation deals between Israel and Arab states, stressing that Palestinians must not have a veto over such agreements. He was talking to the UN General Assembly earlier today, this morning in fact, and he lauded the prospect of formal relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. We talked about these yesterday, didn't we? And he thinks they can underscore the US's role in efforts to broker a pact between the two countries. Well, earlier I spoke to Jarrod Bernstein, former counter-terrorism official for President Obama and former associate director of the White House Office of Public Engagement, responsible for Jewish outreach. And he gave me his reaction to Mr. Netanyahu's comments.
Everybody agrees that it is time for normalization between Israel and the rest of the Arab world. I think, to the extent that we can give credit to former President Trump, the Abraham Accords took a huge step forward in making that a reality. But the one missing piece has always been Saudi Arabia for a variety of reasons. And there's a saying in American politics that all politics are local. Certainly in Saudi Arabia and in Israel, they're at real moments of transition and tumult in their own domestic politics. So I think for both of those leaders, for different reasons, a normalization deal would be an achievement. Certainly in Saudi Arabia, dealing with the Wahhabi factions inside that country, and the long simmering fears of an Iranian nuclear capability. And in Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu certainly has made peace without the settling the Palestinian question, something that he's showing the world is achievable. And to his credit, it has happened with most of the Arab world. So we know that both countries are interested in this happening. The real question is the deal that Saudi Arabia is asking the United States for to make this happen. Is it a deal that the United States can actually do?
And the question, Jarrod, is what is that deal based on? Because Prime Minister Netanyahu said that the Palestinians should not have a veto over any accord, and he held up two maps of Israel showing the West Bank and Gaza, the occupied territories, and the Golan Heights, which used to belong to Syria, as part of Israel. Now, there are going to be some, not just in Saudi Arabia, who would say, no way.
Yeah, and so the real question is, how much does the Saudi government want this deal, and is it more important than their advocacy on behalf of a Palestinian state? I think personally there will have to be some concession made to the Palestinian people in order for this deal to happen, but I don't think that concession is full statehood for the Palestinians. I think that is for a variety of reasons, many of which are at the hands of the Palestinian people and government themselves, is not doable at this moment in time. So any deal that's going to happen, certainly in the near term between Israel and Saudi Arabia, will have to contain something less than statehood for the Palestinian people, because the conditions are just not there for that. But there were other conditions that we've read about being leaked. The Saudi government has leaked the idea that they want a defense guarantee from the United States, similar to the one that we have with Taiwan. They want access to a nuclear program, and that in many circles is considered to be a deal breaker, that the United States is not going to add to another nuclear power to the world stage.
And indeed, why would this powerful Saudi Arabia, with access to a whole panoply of non-nuclear weapons, needs security guarantees from the USA? From what?
I mean, I think the fear that they talk about often is the fear of Iran and Iran regional hegemony. You see Iran funding militias in Yemen, and you see them funding militias with Hezbollah and Hamas. That they are really become the real patron of a lot of these groups, and I think that is what keeps Saudi Arabian leaders up at night. Plus, the idea of a nuclear armed Iran.
And indeed, if, as you suggest, the notion of a viable Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital has to be withdrawn from any potential talks that would result in an accord between Israel and Saudi Arabia, that will only give those in Iran who scream betrayal more fuel, more fire.
Yeah, when I worked for President Obama and you used to walk into the Oval Office and say, "Sir, this is a really hard one," he would look at you glaringly and said, "I sure as hell hope so, because if you're wasting my time on the easy ones, I have other things I could be working on." I mean, I think there's a reason why this deal hasn't gotten done yet, because the questions are really complicated. And certainly the Palestinian question is a complicated one. Everybody agrees the Palestinians should have their own state and their own sovereignty, but under what conditions and with who in charge, and with what security guarantees for Israel. So I think conceptually, we know what it looks like, but I think, as in with most negotiations, the last mile is always what bogs things down.
And so when you look into your crystal ball, as somebody who's worked in this arena for a long time, what do you think would have to shift in order for a viable Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital, something that people have outlined for decades? What would it take for that to be realizable? Who would have to shift?
That's a great question. I think first of all, the domestic political situation in Israel needs to be resolved. I think there's too much uncertainty. The coalition government that's there right now is a right-wing, probably the most right-wing government we've seen in a long time. They are probably most capable of making a deal because they're a right-wing government, and so they won't really be questioned from their right. But we have to see that this question of judicial reform in Israel be settled before any real talks can continue. And we need to see some reform in the current leadership of the Palestinian people, right? So you have the Palestinian Authority, which is very weak and not particularly well run. You see in the West Bank, you see Hamas, which runs Gaza, and they are more well run, but they are in many respects, and in most respects, a terrorist organization, right? They lob missiles into civilian areas in Israel all the time. And so I think, a long-time Middle East hand who had been at this far longer than me told me, we have never been closer on what the substance of the deal looks like. We have never been further away on the psychology of the parties to get us there. There's so much mistrust between the parties in this day and age that I think those are the things that are going to have to be resolved before we see the paper put to the pen, or the pen put to the paper, on what settlements are going to be moved, what areas there's going to be sovereignty over, what are we going to do with Jerusalem, and resolve that question, and the question of the so-called right of return. I think it's more of a question of trust than it is a question of substance at this point. And we can only hope that the parties can find a way to trust each other and take actions that build trust. But at this moment in time, I'm not particularly optimistic, although, I pray for it every day. And every time I'm in synagogue that we say a prayer for peace all the time. And I think this is part of that. But I think, you're going to have to see the domestic political situation in Israel resolved, and you're going to have to see the domestic political situation among the various Palestinian leadership factions resolved.
That was Jarrod Bernstein, who used to specialize in public engagement, particularly with the Jewish community. He's a former associate director at the White House.